All right, everybody, welcome to the very first ever live podcast of Thursday's Theology. I am super excited to be joined by my good friend, the Reverend Dean. I'm super excited to have him on and for this inaugural video podcast. So hopefully the formatting will work out. Hopefully everything will work out, and you'll be seeing this via YouTube or listening to it via the podcast. But all that to say, I'm very, very excited to have you, Dean. Thank you for joining us. I wish I had a cup of coffee to cheers you as well. But so, Dean, the newly ordained Reverend Dean.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. How'd you become involved in youth ministry? What was your upbringing? You know, all the standard questions.
Yeah. So I come from my mother.
Okay.
I was born in Washington State. I was born and raised there, and grew up in a small town called Eatonville, which is kind of nestled into the foothills of Mount Rainier. So not a whole lot going on, but it's home, and so that's where I grew up, and that's where I met Jesus for the first time and put my faith in Christ. And that actually came about through a few different steps, actually. My parents are Christians, but they're first generation Christians. And so they're just trying to figure out how to do life with kids when their parents weren't necessarily, Christians as well. And so that was a challenge for them. And so we started just attending kind of a small house church. For most of my life, we were attending a small house church. Interestingly, before that, I was actually dedicated at a Covenant Church, which is now the denomination I'm ordained in. But small house church, not really much of a youth ministry, and so much of my upbringing, when it came to faith, it felt very lonely, because it was very much, a few other kids my age, but most of the time it was just a lot of older people in the church. It was again, house church size, so maybe like 20 people.
Okay.
And so most of what faith felt like was just trying to, figure out how to not make my parents too angry, or trying to figure out how to, not embarrass myself in front of my friends because I couldn't watch PG-13 movies. It was all that stuff was kind of like, that's sort of the nuances of what faith was for an elementary school, middle school kid. But it was actually in middle school when I definitely kind of felt a specific turning towards God. I won't go into necessarily the details about that, but I still felt a definite sense of loneliness in my faith. But that transition towards understanding that faith is about being a part of a community happened for me in high school. And that was when I got plugged into and started being a part of a youth ministry. It was youth ministry actually that my brother had been a part of, but I figured, that's Big Brother's thing. I don't want to jump in.
Right.
And then his friends, I think it was actually in a Spanish class, his friends invited me to youth group. I was like, well, he can't be embarrassed in front of his friends because his friends invited me. So this is a win. So,
Nice.
So I started attending the youth group, and it was just a huge transformation for me in the way that I sort of understood my faith, because it was no longer just me trying to do something all on my own. It was other people alongside me that I could lean on, and that was really, really helpful. When something's, just that relationship you have with your parents, and they're trying to teach you about faith and about Christ, sometimes it can be a little bit, like, no, Mom, I don't want to, get away, Mom, get away, Dad. Like,
right.
So I was finally able to be a part of that community. That really changed things a lot for me. So that was actually where I decided to be in youth ministry. My youth pastor challenged me to think about that as a vocation, which I had not thought about that before. I had thought about a lot of different things. I think I could have done a variety of different things well, but it was in my junior year when I really started feeling this pull from God to actually pursue and think about youth ministry. And eventually it became something where I just knew that was what God wanted me to do. More than more than anything else, I just knew that that's where God had me headed. And so I pursued a college degree in youth ministry, went to Simpson University in Redding, California, got a youth ministry degree. And that was actually an interesting journey for me, because I had a lot of people who looked at that and they said, you're getting a degree in youth ministry, like shouldn't you get a degree in something else, because what if that falls through? What if that falls apart and you're not able to use youth ministry as a degree? What if you want to join a business or something instead when you graduate?
Right.
So that was a bit of a challenge for me, trying to think through that. And there was a few moments of doubt in my own calling as I was in the midst of that scholarly journey, and had a talk with my youth professor actually at Simpson, and he set me straight, reminded me of my calling and my gifts and everything, and he set me back towards like, no, this is definitely going to be a good path for you. Continue on this journey. And so that, as well as a few other conversations with some other pastors and stuff, were really helpful for me in that journey. But it was definitely filled with doubt, because most of the people who questioned whether or not I should be in that, of course, we're all thinking about finances.
Yeah, of course.
What happens if you can only find a part-time gig? What happens if nothing comes through and you got to start paying off your school loans? And so that's a real concern. It's a practical concern. I mean, everybody is thinking about school loans now, but for somebody who's wondering whether or not there's going to be any kind of a viable job waiting on the other end, that's certainly a real concern. But I think at the end of it all, as I looked back on that, I definitely see the way that God was working sort of all along that journey and all through that path. And I don't think I would have necessarily done it any differently had I gone back, if I had the opportunity to. I've learned so much in the midst of all of that, and in the midst of having those conversations, and just as I've been thinking about and wrestling with my calling and all of that. So
yeah, and no, thank you for sharing, because I think you bring up several important points, and one that really stuck out to me is just the viability of like a youth pastor's role. Because if you look at it in terms of like statistically, the youth pastor's tenure, I've mentioned this before on the YouTube channel and several other places, but the average turnover is 14 months for a youth pastor. The pay is not very good. The life expectancy of of a youth pastor is not very good. I mean, I was told, it made me think about a pastor who told me a while ago that youth ministry is always kind of this stepping stone for more. It's the stepping stone for something else. It's something you're working up towards, that you're using youth ministry to kind of launch yourself into. And I thought about that, and it didn't really sit well with me, because I think that when youth ministry is kind of viewed as this stepping stone, you're not really there for the students. You're there for your own self-worth and self-value, and building yourself up to take on something else. And I think that just kind of, it just goes into this really, really vicious cycle of like, oh, well, our youth pastor is going to be a senior pastor someday, so he's just cutting his teeth on ministry here, so he can eventually get there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I know that there's a lot of people who, they dive into youth ministry for a while, and they just definitely feel a calling to move on to something else. But I think there's a lot of people who step into youth ministry specifically for that reason you mentioned, because this is a ministry that clearly the church is okay with putting somebody in charge of, who doesn't have necessarily a lot of experience. They don't necessarily have everything figured out, and they don't necessarily have a good sense of what it means to be a pastor yet. They don't have a good sense of maybe theology or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And if it's a senior pastor role or an associate pastor role, no, they really need to have a lot more things figured out. But we're okay putting them in charge of our youth.
Right.
They don't necessarily have to have things figured out. Just
Right.
give them some dodgeballs, give them some, give them some space so that, the students can run around and kind of do whatever. Maybe they send them to camp a couple times a year, but by and large, it's not really considered something that you have to invest
Yes.
somebody in who's actually passionate about what they're doing.
Right. Or in some cases, I mean, qualified is a very kind of loose
Right.
term, especially in ministry. But I think that you're exactly right. Where if you look at the majority of youth pastor roles, it often is either somebody who is just starting seminary, is in the middle of seminary, just graduated seminary, and like just has these like, oh, the youth pastor role is the first one that was available to me, and it's exactly what you're talking about. You don't really have that much experience, so we're going to give you kind of a low risk role.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, even saying that makes my stomach churn because I think that youth ministry is such a vital component to the church that if we're giving it kind of this like lackadaisical, like, oh, we'll just hire somebody for the next year and see how it works. Like that's really, really setting some toxic foundation for youth. Because one of the things that breaks my heart as a youth pastor is just to see the number of students that end up walking away from the church after high school. And I think one of the biggest reasons is because they have no sort of consistency and no consistent relationship or presence or somebody drawing them into the church, because their youth pastor, there's been one every other year,
Right.
so
And I know that, a lot of people will go into a variety of different ministries, knowing that they're not going to stay there.
right.
Whether it's, they're going to be a solo pastor for a while and then they're going to move to a different position. And I mean, you kind of go into ministry knowing that at some point you're going to move on to something different. But wherever God places you, you have to have this deep sense that God has placed me here.
Yeah.
But this is where God has me. I don't necessarily understand all of the reasons why. I might not get it all, but this is where God has me. And so I'm going to invest 100% of who I am in this place.
Yes.
I'm not going to invest my resume into this place so that I can build that up, so that I can move on to the thing that I really want to do over here.
Right.
Because that always devalues whoever you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
Community that you're in, whether it's a small church or even if it's a big church, whatever community that you're in, they'll catch on.
Yes.
Especially students, they're not dumb.
Yes.
They are incredibly intuitive, and they know when somebody's faking it. They know when somebody is basically just marking time, essentially.
Yeah.
And I think what you said is especially true because about the lack of consistency for students and the reason why they're walking away from the church in a lot of ways. And I think it really is that lack of consistency. And I would say beyond even to just the youth pastor, the broader issue within I think our whole culture that is seeped into the church as well is that youth have been just largely abandoned.
Yeah.
There's a lot of research that has been out about this. I mean, for like 15 years, it's not brand new by any means. Chap Clark did a lot of this stuff. Sticky Faith kind of built on a lot of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, it's the idea that for faith to really be something that is for a lifetime, to really grab a hold of a student, it's got to be more than just one person, every week at a youth group telling them about faith.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of ways, just the practical side of it is students don't know what the rest of the church is like. They don't know, and they don't have a connection with the rest of the church. Then they're going to graduate and they're going to have no idea what to do because their spiritual life has all been youth group. So what happens when they graduate? What happens when they move on? Are they ready for that transition? And I think a lot of the time in youth ministry, for a lot of the way it was done, it was structured as its own siloed thing.
Yes.
For a very, very long time. And so people just kept walking away from the church over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And even when I think churches tried to start saying, hey, maybe we should get them plugged in a little bit more with a church service on a Sunday morning, there was still a relational lack of connection.
Yeah.
older adults were still not connecting with teenagers, and still aren't, I would say, in
Right. And I think one of the things that you point out, absolutely, I 100% agree. And what I have seen happen time and time again is when youth do get involved in a Sunday morning church or service or whatever the church is doing, um, it often, more often than not, devolves into the older generation of people in the church giving unsolicited advice to the youth, like, oh, you shouldn't be doing this, you should be focusing on this, you should be doing that. And that can be like, who, if you're a youth, who, why would you want to be a part of that community if all you're hearing is like, oh, everything you're doing in your life is wrong and you need to be doing this you need to be reading your Bible every single day, you need to be praying every single day, and blah blah, XYZ. And it's just, it can be a very, very like alienating experience
Right.
in
Right.
the community.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
uh,
I totally agree. And again, that is a symptom of a larger cultural issue where teachers, coaches, parents, even, I mean, everybody is in large part kind of trying to, they're just doing their own thing as a coach or as a teacher or as a parent, and students are sort of caught in this vortex of just bouncing around between one thing to the next and not necessarily feeling like they have anybody they can connect with or open up and share about what's really going on in their life. And that's not true for every student. It's not true for every family or every location, but it's true for a lot of places. And that's,
mhm.
I think, in a large part, that is sort of this undercurrent that has kind of crept into the church, where all the older generation and even middle-aged generation are sort of okay with disconnecting from what's going on in the lives of students
Yeah.
and not really being a part of that process anymore.
Right.
And whether it's because of cynicism, they say, oh, well, they're never going to listen to me anyway, or whatever it might be.
Right.
But the biggest thing is that uh, what students are really looking for is somebody who will just listen to them
Yes.
more than anything else. Students are
Mhm.
looking for somebody who will just sit and listen to them and hear what they have to say and ask questions, because it's highly likely that the questions they're asking one day are going to be totally different in a couple months.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're in a process of maturing. They're in a process of growing. And I think it's very true what you said. If we could just jump in and we sort of just tell them all the time what to do and what to think, that's not going to go over very well.
Yeah.
Teenagers, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to figure out how to be able to do this on their own. And if your goal is to help somebody actually ride a bike on their own, but you keep propping them up like, oh no, don't follow left, don't follow the right, don't follow left. Well, I'm just going to have to fall over. I'm
Mhm.
going to have to go to the left one time. I'm going to have to wipe out. I'm going to have to skin my knee. Just let me do it. I'll learn. I'll figure it out.
Right.
And I think, I think sometimes in the interest of trying to, whether people think it's protecting orthodoxy or protecting, the faith or whatever, there's this pressure to try and make students think a certain way and be a certain
Right.
way.
And I think it also has to do, I think you mentioned it earlier, but I think it's based in fear, because I think that this mentality that, oh, the church is one or two generations from dying is real in a lot of churches, where it all of a sudden becomes like, oh, we don't need to, be a relational youth group. We need to be a doctrinal youth group so that students will adhere to the doctrine and carry on the faith for us and stuff like that. And I don't, I don't, I don't like that at all.
Yeah, and there's so much. I mean, when you look at just the roots of the Reformation, which I mean, obviously, when we're talking about youth ministry, we would want to include all youth ministry that's happening across all denominations, but especially within the Protestant Church, we're rooted in a movement that was okay with disagreeing with someone. It was okay with disagreeing with the Catholic Church, and then
Right.
Luther was okay with disagreeing with Calvin. And so, unfortunately, that has meant a lot of church splits.
Right.
And so, one of the things that I think we have to learn how to be able to do better and has really just kind of come to a head, again, culturally speaking, is being able to have conversations with people, to disagree, even at the end of the day, disagree, and
Hmm.
still continue to be in a church together, continue
Hmm.
to live together, and continue to say, you know what, we disagree on this, but we both love Christ. We both want to follow Christ. And who knows, maybe the Holy Spirit is going to direct one of us, towards the other's viewpoint, or maybe somehow we're going to meet in the middle someday. But for
Right.
right now, let's continue to focus on the main things, loving God, loving our neighbor,
Hmm.
and uh, doing good mission in the world, and,
Yeah.
and seeking to build up and love our communities. All of those things which are are just kind of the basic things, even as you read through the Gospels of what Jesus did and what he was about.
Right.
Um, and those things just get bogged down by, unfortunately, a lot of arguments about things which at the end of the day don't necessarily amount to that much,
Yeah.
but in the moment people think that they do, and so they get very
And what's funny to me is, so for anybody watching or for anybody listening, what Dean just said and what Dean just illustrated is basically the poster and the advertisement for the Covenant Church.
yeah,
Because the hope that the covenant is that where we could have divergent viewpoints and we can faithfully dissent from one another, but it's not going to cause us to go off and split from each other. It's not going to cause us to break relationship with one another and seek another denomination or what have you.
yeah,
So I just thought that was funny because, like, as you were saying, I was like, oh yeah, we're both covenant pastors,
yeah,
and
yeah,
that just stuck out to me. Um, so I think you're absolutely right. Where there's a lot of things that kind of cordon off youth ministry in the church, and I think that is to the detriment of both the youth and the church overall. Um so I don't know where I'm going with this. I just was processing out loud, but it seems to me that churches often misunderstand the way to really reach youth and to really draw them in, because I know that every church that I've been a part of and every church that I've talked to has always said, like, oh, we value youth, we value them being here, we value their presence. But more or less, like, I can't look at that and say, like, oh yeah, well, based on the way you act, based on the way you have your church structured, it does reflect that you care for youth. Like, I don't think I can say that. So that's the perennial problem for us youth pastors, is to how to bridge that gap between youth
yeah,
and the overall church. Because I think that when we have youth group and youth worship on Sunday and stuff like that, we kind of run the risk of perpetuating this, like, oh, the youth is separate from the life of the church.
right,
So yeah, the problem's real, the struggle is real on that.
yeah, yeah. And I know a lot of churches have gone to a model of doing a separate youth service during the Sunday morning worship service,
Yeah.
and um, and not to step on any toes, because I know a lot of churches do that, and they're still trying to find other ways to incorporate those students into the life of the church in other ways. Um, but at some point, those students do have to be integrated into that worship service,
Yes.
because if they aren't, then we're just doing them a disservice. And if students kind of grow up with I go and do my own kind of church thing on Sunday mornings, my parents do their thing, my younger siblings do their thing. I mean, everybody is split up and everybody's separate and everybody's
Yeah.
in places. And so that those are the formative years of your life. And so you're learning habits about what community looks like.
Yeah.
And if community just looks like in the same building, but being in different rooms, it's not really integrated community.
Yeah.
And I've seen churches where that's sort of the model, and what ends up happening is, even at the college level, there's sort of another offshoot thing that happens, where a lot of those college students who were in high school and middle school ministry with that kind of model and mindset are now doing their own thing on a
Yeah.
Sunday morning. And so it kind of perpetuates that system over and over and over again.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of it is rooted too in an unwillingness to talk to each other,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's an unwillingness to come to a resolution about disagreements, about whether it's anything from worship style to preaching style or whatever it might be.
Hmm.
People are unwilling to come to sort of an agreement. They're unwilling to talk to each other, and yet disconnecting and sending each other off to separate rooms only perpetuates that same thing. It'll
Yes.
only perpetuate the same lack of conversation, unfortunately. And so
Hmm.
it's hard work. It's hard work to be able to say, hey, we've got to make some changes because of X, Y, or Z,
Hmm.
to be able to be more inclusive to the youth, because they're not really feeling it right now. And here's why.
Hmm.
And you can't just disregard what they're saying, because, well, this is the way we've always done it, or we can't do it because of this or that or that. Okay, you still need to listen to what they're saying. You still have
Right.
to, you still have to acknowledge where they're coming from, because if you don't, they're just going to feel written off, and they
Hmm.
will, um, before
Yeah.
they graduate high school.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And I'm so glad you brought up college too, because that's I'm thankful that my job description also includes college ministry, and that's something that I've really really enjoyed. Um, but it is really really hard to do college ministry, especially with students who have been raised in the church and told, like, given a laundry list of things that they can't do when they go off to college, and when they do those things, then they're like, oh, well, I can't go back to church, like that I clearly violated these rules, so I'm not going to be accepted there. But I think the problem goes deeper than that. I think the problem goes deeper than just shame based and saying like, oh, you shouldn't do this. I think it's what you mentioned, and that is there hasn't really been a healthy pattern of them being plugged into the life of the church, that they can come back and be like, oh, you know what, I really messed up. I'm going to go seek out my mentor that I've been meeting with for the past 4 years, or I'm going to go ask for prayer from the pastor. So there's all these things that college students don't have in their back pocket when they go off, and they just end up walking away and kind of doing their own thing for a while. And that's really really hard to do college ministry well, because you have students who are um, really really cynical towards the church, and I don't blame them, like especially the way that most of them have been treated and raised to view the church and stuff like that. I don't blame their cynicism.
yeah,
um but I think that the important work of youth ministry is to help deeply establish and deeply root students in an identity of, you are part of a larger community, and this community is there for you no matter what.
yeah,
um so
absolutely. Yeah, and two things, kind of just as you were talking, I was thinking about. One is that it's important to get students involved actually in the service itself on a Sunday morning. It's not enough to just say like, okay, we're going to change a couple songs. Um, get them plugged into being part of the sound team or the media team or the worship team, to be ushers, reading scripture, all of those things, which are going to happen on a Sunday morning, depending on the church structure and all of that. But to get them to be a part of all of those aspects, because unless you do, they're never going to be able to see that as something that they're actually needed. You
yeah.
know,
Yeah.
um, are they just a nice visual to have? Because, oh, look, we've got some old people, we got some young people.
Right.
Wow, look at our church. Or is it, no, I actually need you here. I need you
Yeah.
to run the soundboard. I need your gifts. I need your talents. And I want your input to know how to be able to do this better. And I want your actual talent input to be
Yes.
part of, and your gifts and your calling from God to be a part of this as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Uh, the second thing I was thinking about is what you mentioned about how students will, they'll go to college or something like that. They'll find themselves, maybe they'll make a few mistakes or something like that, and then they'll feel this sense of shame.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I was talking with our students about is that difference between guilt and shame.
Mm-hmm.
Guilt in the sense that, you did something wrong, and so it's more just a fact, versus shame, which is kind of this lasting sense of, I am wrong, I am bad. There's something wrong with me.
Right.
And that aspect is what is toxic and crippling
Mm-hmm.
uh, to faith actually growing, and to understanding and experiencing the love of God. And so it's basically helping students understand, you might not know what's going to happen in your life, in the next 10-20 years of your life, but even if you end up uh, and especially if you end up as the prodigal son off somewhere in a pigsty, and you want to come home,
Yeah.
like, come home.
Yeah.
um, there is nothing you could ever do. There's no place you could ever go. There's no sin you could ever commit that will ever make God stop loving you.
Yeah.
And as a church, we've got to not only say that about God, but we've also got to come to a place where we're able to honestly say that about the church.
Yes.
There's nothing that could ever happen. There's nothing you could ever do that would make us as a church stop loving you.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
when you've done something really bad or horrible or whatever, come back and be a part of this community. Don't
Mm-hmm.
continue to distance yourself. Don't continue to separate yourself.
Right.
And the church has got to take that example of the father who's like gripping the railing of the porch, like
Mm-hmm.
peering out, wondering, where is my son? Where is my son? Where did they go? I want them back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And running out to meet them. That's the posture that the church needs to have.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the church is more or less had in arms crossed, sitting on the chair on the porch, like, oh, so you're back, huh?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you stop sinning?
Mm-hmm.
That's been the posture of the church.
Yeah.
And this is where I think, on the whole, our discipleship of everyone in the church has been lacking.
Yeah.
Because people have not really wrestled with that. People have not really wrestled with the fact that parable that Jesus tells of the prodigal son is actually told, honestly, for the Pharisees, because he includes that older son.
Yeah.
Oftentimes people sort of end it with the first son, but the second son is actually the older son
Yes.
is an important part of that parable, because Jesus is telling it to Pharisees to say, and guess who you are in this parable? You're
Right.
the old. You're out in the fields slaving away, and you think that because you stayed and you worked so hard, you deserve more, and you are better than the son
Mm-hmm.
that you're just as distant and you're just as far away from your father. And so that is just such the humility within our discipleship, and for practicing real compassion and mercy and grace within our churches has unfortunately been very, very lacking.
Yeah.
And so it's unfortunate that we have not, as a whole church, done better in terms of that discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
As pastors, even elders, other lay people in the church could have that posture of the father who's willing to run out and meet that person.
Mm-hmm.
But after somebody talks to them, they have 3, 4, 5 conversations with a bunch of self-righteous, nose in the air Christians who are looking down all of these terrible sinners. I can't believe that. I can't believe they showed up. I can't believe, what are they doing here?
Yeah.
And I mean, I've been a part of, congregations in the past where things like that have happened, and sometimes it's related to something that person did or said that was really mean or destructive, and that's why they kind of were ostracized a bit. And so it's not a simple thing by any means. It's not
Right.
some nice, easy, neat little thing that all you have to do is just just be more welcoming. But it's what the gospel demands of us.
Yeah.
It's what discipleship demands of us.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we have not we have not taught that very well.
Yeah.
So I was reading this blog. Fuller Youth Institute puts out a lot of really good, I guess you'd call them blog posts. They're on their website. They'll send out emails and stuff like that. You can, just kind of like follow what they're doing. And they've been sending out some stuff right now about virtue and how do we develop virtue in students,
Mm,
to actually develop the kind of character qualities that Christians ought to be exhibiting. And I
mhm,
think the number one thing would be that deep sense of compassionate love for the world,
mm,
compassionate love that looks beyond whatever issues or problems might be having in somebody's life, to reach out to them, to love them right where they're at, to care for them right where they're at, even if there's something inside you that makes you squirm because of whatever it is that they're doing,
right.
to still reach out to them. And in the development of that virtue, we have, again, as a whole church, we have lacked being able to help people develop that virtue. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, because we've been talking about it without necessarily helping people really integrate that into their life and finding ways to actually practice it so that it can be developed, so that it can be an actual part of their discipleship.
Right. Yeah. And there's a couple things that came up for me when you were just sharing too. One is my a few years ago, my spiritual director, and for those of you who don't know what spiritual direction is, it's a service that people in the church, pastors, lay people, anybody who wants can meet with what's called a spiritual director, and they are trained to listen to you. They're trained to listen, to ask questions and stuff like that, and to point out where it is the Holy Spirit is at work in your life, or where it is that God might be moving you and stuff like that. So it's a really, really cool practice to have. So my spiritual director a few years ago, we were talking after our session, and I was bemoaning the fact that I had, some uphill battles to fight in the church. There were some older people on the board that I had to really anyway, the point being is that I was kind of frustrated with the church. And my spiritual director told me, he asked me, you realize what the problem with the church is, right? And I was like, what's that? And he was just like, it's filled with people. And I thought it was a joke for a second, but he was totally serious, and he went on to explain, like, we often over idealize our churches, by saying like, oh, these are perfect institutions, these are perfect things, and that's not the case at all. The churches are filled with broken and hurting people, and I think it was, I could be completely wrong, but I think it was Mother Teresa who said that churches should be hospitals for the broken and not museums for the perfect.
Yeah.
And I think that that's just a perfect summation of what the church should be, because when it becomes like you were saying, like the cross arm, like, oh, you're back, I guess are you done sinning yet? Like, then that sets up a really, really toxic understanding of what the church is, and kind of undercuts the healing capability of the church.
Yeah.
And then the second thing that came up is the prodigal son. I love the prodigal son. That's probably my favorite parable, because I think it's the entirety of the gospel can be summed up in that parable.
Timothy Keller has a really good book on that called The
Oh
Prodigal
yeah,
God.
yep, it's great. Um, and the thing that came up for me was your mention of the older son in the story. And one of the things that I always challenge my students with, especially ones that have been raised in the church, is that Jesus doesn't tell us how the older son reacts. Like, he just kind of leaves it on a cliffhanger. The older
Right.
son is invited into the party, but then the parable stops. And I think the point being is that we, as people who have been established in the church and raised in the church, and have this history of faith and stuff like that, we have to decide for ourselves how we're going to react to our prodigal sisters and brothers coming home. Like, are we going to keep to our moralistic, legalistic code and stay outside, or are we going to enter into the celebration when they come home?
Yeah.
And I think that that's like a very, very chilling challenge, kind of left at the very like end of that parable.
And I think, it's interesting because we often look back at the Pharisees and we see that the way that they did things. And I would say almost unanimously across the board in the church, people look at the Pharisees and go, "Oh yeah, dumb Pharisees! Can't believe
Right.
they did that." You know,
Right.
the Pharisees. How could they be so naive and so full of themselves and all of that? But I think the Pharisees were a whole bunch of people who, in their honest evaluation of themselves, believed that they were following God
Yeah.
and that they were doing what God wanted them to do.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, though, what Jesus calls out is that there is a reason behind their ethics that is
Hmm.
not actually ethical.
Right.
There's a reason behind their morals that is not actually following God. And essentially what it amounted to was they wanted to make sure that they didn't get destroyed again.
Yeah.
Um, because in their reading of scripture, they see that all of this destruction that came on Israel was all because we're no longer following the law. So
Hmm.
it's this kind of self-preservation idea. And I
Hmm.
think a lot of that self-preservation idea is very prevalent, not only in our culture today, but also in the church in terms of ethics.
Yeah.
Be a good person because then you'll get a good job. Be honest because you'll be able to keep your job. Do these good practices with finances because then you'll be able to make money. And so
Mhm.
it's all ethics is all sort of pertaining to your own self-preservation. If you do something good for somebody, make sure that other people know about it because then you'll look good on your college application or you'll look
Right.
good on your next resume that you
Right.
send out. And so all of it is this sense of trying to maintain your status
Yeah.
within society, wherever it is that you are.
Yeah.
So that attitude about ethics has creeped into the church.
Mm.
Ethics is primarily for ourselves, even though we say it's about, helping other people. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that everybody knows I'm gonna put this on my resume. I'm gonna do this
Right.
and Z. And it's not actually for the sake of our communities. It's not actually for the sake of serving others. Again, Timothy Keller, I was listening to his podcast about this, and he's talking actually in the context of pride and humility.
Hmm.
Pride being a very always being a self-focused inward thing,
Yeah.
and whether or not even whether or not you're down on yourself and you're beating yourself up because I just can't believe I'm so terrible. I can't believe I didn't do this right. I didn't do that right. Or you're basically saying that you think you're the best thing in the world. He says is both rooted essentially in the same kind of thing,
Right.
where you're always focused on yourself, whereas in humility you're looking towards others and you're
Right.
thinking about how you can help others. Well, I mean that's Philippians 2, right? That's
Yeah.
what
Yeah. I was just gonna say, yeah.
with what Jesus does. He comes and he does not seek to do anything for his own gain.
Hmm.
Even the very fact that he is God, he did not hold on to. He did not see it as something to be grasped onto to say this is for my own benefit.
Yeah.
But he had every right to
Yeah.
let that go.
Yeah. No.
Unfortunately, we don't teach that very well in church, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it goes back to something that you were saying earlier about the Fuller Youth Institute, just the idea of virtue, where virtue is kind of a lost art. And not only for youth, like for the church in general.
Yeah.
Because I think that what you're talking about pride and humility and stuff like that, what really just jumped out to me was the social media culture that students find themselves in. Because
Right.
I know I don't know if this phrase has been around longer than just this past year, but it's only in this past year that I've heard it. But what are called social media influencers, where it's people with a certain amount of followers that corporations will target to say like, hey, we will sponsor you if you give us a shout out or whatever. And these influencers are highly, highly, highly influential on students' lives. But I think that that's kind of the mentality that a lot of students have grasped onto, when it comes to, I'm only important if I have X amount of followers. I'm only valuable if I have X amount of people commenting or whatever. And I think it's just another incarnation of pride, really. So
Right.
I think that where you're absolutely correct is how to train students to break that and be the countercultural in their thinking, and instead
Yeah.
of saying like, oh, I'm only gonna like look at how many followers I have, to saying like, hey, you know what, that doesn't really matter to me. I'm going to spend my life outwardly focused as opposed to inwardly focused. Like that's a huge thing to try and
Right.
to impart and teach.
Yeah. And what we have, unfortunately, what we have taught students implicitly is that the way to be able to impact the world is through a, self-focused, look at me, look what I'm doing.
Right.
Uh, the example Jesus gave is exactly the opposite. The example Jesus gave was always to love and to serve with humility without ever expecting anything back.
Yeah.
And again, that goes entirely against everything that students are being taught and trained in right now,
Hmm.
because you better be able to count this on your college applications and your resume, and all of that stuff has got to be, I only got so much time in the day, so if I can't count this on, you know
Yeah.
something that's going to count, then why should I care about that, and why
Yeah.
that um which is incredibly unfortunate, because at the same time I feel like the younger generation is looking at all of these issues in the world knowing that, hey, this is going to be stuff that I'm going to have to deal with. All of these issues with pollution, all of these issues with, you know, um, global warming. I mean, any of these different things that like come up, and trying to be able to find some kind of a solution to it. But are we actually teaching students the kinds of ethics that are going to help them make better decisions?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
just the very simple things of, for instance, pollution. Just take that as a small example. But if somebody's walking by on the street and they see some trash on the ground, do we leave it? Do we pick it up?
Hmm.
And if you pick it up and you throw it away, no one's going to care.
Hmm.
What are you going to do? Snap a pic and put it on Instagram? Look at this trash I picked up. I'm such a good person. Like,
Right. Right.
no one's going to like that photo,
Right.
So
Right.
it's one of those things where there's nothing really in place, and there's nobody telling them to live in with that kind of radical humility in a
Yeah.
world that is so self-focused.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's a huge reason why youth ministry is so important, um, because so much of the culture around that surrounds youth is self-focused. So
Yeah.
much of the adults they encounter are self-focused, and so what else are they going to be trained in? What else are they going to be taught to do?
Right.
To be self-focused.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and that's yeah. I mean, you you took the words right out of my mouth. That's the perfect way to sum it up. And actually, that is a good place to kind of bring us to our closing thoughts. It's great because I've always told people on my podcast, like, oh, aim for 20 to 30 minutes. But then sometimes we just get caught in a conversation. It just keeps going and going. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate your passion for youth ministry, and I can tell the audience from personal experience how great of a youth pastor you are, because I've seen you in action. I've seen how you care for your students, and I'm grateful to know you, man. I really do appreciate that.
Likewise,
Uh,
likewise.
so the final thoughts, you kind of touched upon it already, but just in a few sentences, or however long you want to go off on it. Um, why is youth ministry important for you?
Well, I think, and this is something that everybody who's in ministry and everybody's a pastor has to think about is, um, in what way is God moving and working in your own life, and in what way are you connecting with God? So you mentioned spiritual direction. I also have a spiritual director, other spiritual practices that are important in my life that uh, help to keep me grounded.
Hmm.
And when I just think about my own life, when I think about the necessity of clinging to God through everything, um, and not because it's some kind of cosmic crutch or something like that. I mean,
Right.
the world sort of sees it as that,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
this is what we were made for. We were made to have a relationship with our Creator. We were made to be in loving, harmonious community with God and with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the world is literally ripping apart at the seams when you just turn on the news any day, and you'll see that. And so when I think about the reasons why youth ministry is important, it's because people are important, and because God values people. I know God values me, and I know that in my relationship with God, I know from firsthand experience that God values me and that God loves me, that I'm made in God's image, and that each and every one of the students at our schools, each and every one of those students who is battling depression, each and every one of those students who is struggling with their sexuality or has come out and has been rejected by the church, each and every student who is just lonely and doesn't have any friends, each and every student that feels like there's no adults to talk to actually share what's going on in their life. For each and every one of those students, God loves them, God values them, not just now as a student, but when they're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. And youth ministry is important because we are not just caring for people for 4 years or 7 years, whatever the longevity of your ministry range is. We're seeking to help people build a foundation so that they can continue to be in this relationship with God, so that the gospel is more than just something they believed one time at a camp.
Yep.
The gospel is something that transforms their life. It's something that transforms their communities. It's something that transforms their families. And that is why youth ministry is important to me, because
Amen.
I know that youth ministry impacted me. When I was in high school, youth ministry impacted me. And I know that it totally transformed the way I saw faith. And so youth ministry is important, and it's important that we do it well. Specifically,
Yeah.
it's just important that it's happening.
Yeah.
It's important that we do it well. Because not just because we want our future to be secure, as you said.
Right.
It's not just because we want the world to not blow up in 50 years. It's because and we have got to start sending a better message to the church and to our students that students are valued and students are loved.
Yeah.
They're not tomorrow.
I absolutely agree.
And we've got to start treating them that way, and we've got to start creating better structures so that they can actually be a part of the church now.
Yeah.
Not just the nice picture that we put on our website, so people say, "Hey, look, they've got a youth ministry."
Right.
Kids there.
Right. And yeah, that's something I've always told students, and even if they don't believe it, I've always tried to reiterate it. I've told them, you are far more important to the church than you think. You are far more valued. You're far more loved than you realize. And I think the hard work for us is to take that sentiment and show them the reality of it. So. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Dean, for joining us. This has been the Thursdays Theology podcast. And yeah, remember, theology doesn't always have to be difficult. It is simply the study of who God is. Take care. We'll see you next time.